Oh, okay, there we go. It says started.
Recording has started.
Oh, now it's good. All right, I
Yeah,
guess
it's telling me.
it waited. It was like until we search it out on chat. It didn't want to get usurped by AI. That's what it
Yeah,
was.
it panicked that you were going to go elsewhere.
Yeah, that's Microsoft branding right there. It said no,
That's
please.
right.
Not a third party app. But all right, we're here today. This is the first episode of the podcast, and I don't even know what we're doing here, but it's just amazing to be here. My name's Carter Truman, as always, and today, ladies and gentlemen, we have an eminent scholar, a gentleman and a scholar, really. And if it couldn't get any better, he's also British. So just give it up for Ben Holloway, Doctor Ben Holloway. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on. This is it's a great honor to be your first guest.
Yeah, yeah, honestly. I mean, it's an honor for me to have you as the first guest. That's what's really special. So I guess today as we're starting out, just give the people an introduction because you have one of the most fascinating lives I've ever heard of, and we can get into that later, but just give them a brief intro to who you are.
Uh, well, I take it you don't want my entire life story, but I am a Brit, so maybe you wonder how on earth I ended up as a philosophy professor at a seminary for the Southern Baptists when I was born in London, in 1973. How does that journey occur? Well, mostly because I am interested in communicating the gospel to the nations and interested in evangelism and those sorts of things. That's how I got started in ministry. I became a Christian when I was about 10 years old, but in my teens, I felt a very strong call to evangelistic ministry. And then I joined Youth for Christ in England when I left school. I had no degrees, though, nothing. I didn't go to college or university or anything like that. So I'm probably voted at my high school, what you would call my high school, would probably vote me as sort of least likely to be a professor. Some might say even metaphysically impossible, given my nature, that I would be a professor. It would be like, asking a number to do a dance. It's just metaphysically can't be done. So I confounded everybody by ending up here, but I got into ministry, wanted to do evangelism, did itinerant evangelism with Youth for Christ, mostly in music ministry. And then as time went on, I realized my lack was becoming more and more obvious to me. I knew my Bible vaguely, um, but didn't really know it well. So I could give an evangelistic talk because that requires, some knowledge of Genesis 1 through 3, and then some of the gospel, and that's it. But I had very little in-depth knowledge of the Bible. I needed that, but also I had lots of questions that were given to me as I traveled. I met thousands of teenagers, and they would often be filled with questions that I couldn't answer. And the only answers I could give them were the answers that I'd learned from somebody else. So I became good at repeating what other people had said. And my criteria for choosing what I would say was, generally speaking, what I thought would sound good. And so I lacked that kind of intellectual foundation. And as time went on, that glaring lack became more and more um, into my awareness. So eventually, before I got married, my soon-to-be wife had got an education. She had been to an undergraduate school, got a theological degree, and had was most of the way through her master's in Old Testament. And one day, she and I were having tea. And she described the Old Testament, told me the story from beginning to end, and I thought, that's it. I need that. So eventually I applied. We got married, and I had, a ministry and a fairly secure job directing a ministry in Oxford in England. And I had got involved in getting some education from Oxford University at the time. They allowed people who didn't have any sort of decent qualifications to be there to take kind of part-time classes there. So I got instruction from Alistair McGrath and David Wenham and people like that, really good scholars, and I loved it. And the hole in my soul became very obvious to me that I needed some intellectual foundations for ministry. And so I applied to Moody Bible Institute, and in 2007 we sold everything in England and came and moved to Chicago, and I did my undergrad and loved it, absolutely loved it, and wanted more. And as well as loving it, I knew what I wanted to do. I thought those foundations I am now getting built in me, and because I did it so late, I realized just how valuable they were, and so wanted to become someone who could give them to other people, whether that were giving it to people in their late in their life, like I had received it, or starting out. Oh, how I wish I had it starting out. But the Lord, I think, made it that way so that I would love it to a high degree. I see how valuable it is. The treasure of having those intellectual foundations built is just immeasurable. And so at that point, I knew I wanted to teach. And so I kept going. I did my master's at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School under John Feinberg and Keith Yandel, if those names mean anything, Tom McCall, to some of those great sort of pioneers in analytic philosophy applied with theology, and then and philosophy of religion. And then I did my PhD here under the tutelage of Greg Welty. And amazingly, the Lord answered my prayer for a spot for me to be able to pass on what others have given to me to the next generation and to others who attend. And so they offered me a job here, first adjunct, and then as an instructor, and then assistant professor, and recently elected to faculty. So I've had a great journey here. It's the best place on earth, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and Judson College, to work and to study and to be. So here I'm in a very, very happy spot with some great people, all serving the Lord. And amazingly, this seminary is extremely well focused on the things that got me into this in the first place. Their desire to reach the nations with the gospel is absolutely where I started out. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to tell people about Jesus, and that was where I started in ministry, and it's where I still am, propelling people out there to go and reach people with the gospel. So it's a very exciting place to be, very dynamic as well as very serious. So here I am.
It's great to have you, honestly. You are probably without a doubt one of the best professors I've ever had, and I now have I'm going on 3 degrees. So that at 3 very different degrees. I had journalism and then psychology and now an MDiv. So you've definitely stood above quite a bit of professors from different places. So it's just great to have you.
Very kind of you to say so, and kind of you to have me.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I honestly, your story, the more I learn about you, the less I want to say the less I believe, but I know you're telling the truth, which is why it's so unbelievable. You have a background that if you described it, it would sound like an ad lib. Like you were genuinely a rock star, and
Wow.
you did evangelism it just blew my mind. You had so many pieces to this long puzzle, and you hold them all together, and then you show up to class and you teach philosophy, which if people don't know typical philosophy professors, that's a bit of an odd mix right there.
Yeah, generally philosophers get into it through other routes. It's not unique though, coming from the arts, particularly. Like my passions were reaching people with the gospel, but also using the arts to do so. So my evangelistic ministry with Youth for Christ was mostly music based. But but so lots of philosophers are sort of previously interested in science, perhaps, or math. You think about René Descartes. He's a good scientist and a good mathematician. That's why we have Cartesian coordinates. He didn't start by, studying poetry. But I don't think it's unique to come from the arts into this sort of world, and particularly combined with my emphasis on using the arts to reach people with the gospel, where just you're going to automatically have to do apologetics. And so lots of people in Christian philosophy get there via a desire to, answer those difficult questions about one's faith that one encounters all the time. And so that was me as well. So yeah, but maybe I've just had too many. I've not been concentrated on one thing enough. The one common strand is that this is for the aim of reaching the nations with the gospel. Even whatever role I play, I might be in a classroom with teenagers in Britain or I hear in a classroom with Christians in America, the aim has stayed the same for me, that this is a sort of propulsion for serving the Lord by proclaiming the gospel far and wide. So that tends to be what I aim at ultimately in all that I've done, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely nice to have an aim. I don't know if I've found my unifying thread at the moment.
Hmm.
I genuinely like to learn. Some of the stuff
Yeah.
you I feel like that's how they get you. You start out in like undergrad and you really think you know everything. And you're like, "Oh, this is like I totally got this." And then you get the master's degree, you get a little taste of that like, "Oh, there's more." And then you're like, "I know absolutely nothing now." And so that just keeps like pushing you to try to finally get your balance. And by the time you get your PhD, I just feel like you still don't know anything. I feel like you're still just always angling for that higher step.
Yeah, I mean, PhD I recommend to people because um, you never lose that. In fact, it's increased by the end of your PhD. Um, you might think that you could master everything or master something. It would be very small. But by the time you finish a PhD, you think there's absolutely no way. You are much more aware of the lack of knowledge that you have than
Oh
you
yeah.
were when you first started and you didn't have any of these degrees. But that actually is the crucial ingredient for being a professor.
Yeah.
Actually, you have to sort of realize your your finiteness, and that makes teaching fun too, because I never teach um, I never teach without having learned something. So even if I'm repeating something I've learned before, I've got to make it fresh. So for example, classes that I've taught several times, I use new books that to study from, even if I don't make the students read them. I might use the textbook I've always used, but I'm using another textbook because I want to learn. And each time it gets revised and changed in light of what I learn. So that's absolutely right. You get more hungry for learning the further you go.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's definitely that's what's I mean, I 100% bought all these books just to like make this studio set look nice, but I've also read a few of them too.
Good.
And like once you read them, you're just hooked. You just keep
Hmm.
going. I've
Yeah.
bought a lot of the books on this shelf from reading the bibliographies in some of the books on this shelf. So it's just it stacks and it multiplies and you just run out of room, honestly. But yeah, it's a dangerous hobby. Once you get into it, you're like, I'm stuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Immensely enjoyable too.
Oh yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear you are enjoying it.
Yes. Yeah. I think too, I think people would be surprised just how interesting you make a logic class, which is, that sounds like an easy thing to do. But I find sometimes that if you don't just have a natural kind of appreciation for philosophy, a lot of times it can be like dry and sterile. And sometimes it's because the professor is sort of dry and sterile. But in the best way possible, you teach philosophy to college students like you're teaching a kindergarten class. And I think it's I think it's important because a lot of times when you're in college, it's easy to kind of glaze over and just be like, it's whatever. But you have like interactive, fun lessons with like learning devices that are sort of silly and they work. They work. That's just you're like, that's perfect. Now I know. I'm like, oh, this is modus ponens. I've got it.
Yeah. Well, I tend to think that most people learn something abstract by starting with something quite familiar. And so I guess I teach things from that perspective, is that, everybody's familiar with something to do with what I'm going to talk about. And if I start there, generally speaking, by the time I've finished where I've started, you're interested in what perhaps the answer might be, or you have been disabused of the I don't know if that's the right word, but you've stopped thinking that this is going to be something irrelevant. By the time I've started to talk about the meat of the class, that's at least my intention. So I'm very that the compliments are wonderful, and that's exactly my intention, is to make sure that you're never too far away from how this relates to life. In fact, that's really how seminaries are. Seminaries are deeply theoretical, right? I mean, think of what the Lord gave us. He gave us a very complicated book, written over a period of many years by many people of various writing styles in languages we don't naturally speak. And we have to do a lot of work to mine it for its depths. And so it's intellectually difficult, no matter what you do. You couldn't make a seminary easy. It's just not in the nature of the way God revealed himself to us. So you're going to have to think really, really hard.
Yeah.
And it's fruitful, but that's the way the Lord made it. I mean, you could ask him why he didn't give you a download when you get to see him. But in the meantime, we know how he has given us what he wants us to know through a very complicated book. So becoming good at thinking is just not, it goes with the territory of a seminary. But a seminary is always has aims. Like it's never just the theory. You are aiming at what you're being asked to do by the Lord in what you've learned from what he's given you. So so like law school is similar. Dr. Mosley made this, one of my esteemed colleagues, excellent professor, made this analogy, and I thought it's absolutely right. It's like law school in that law school is really hard because it has to train you to do something that's very, very important. And so seminary is like that too. Like it's intellectually rigorous. It's not easy just to float through because why? Well, because you're going to do something very, very important and you need to be trained really, really well to do it. So some of you are going to go be missionaries and you've got to have your ethics straight. Some of you are going to be pastors and you've got to be able to have your languages straight. All of these disciplines that we have here are training you for something. So that's different than just merely being interested in what's true and what's false. There is that. And if it wasn't there, then it would be a great deal of waste of time. It would be just whatever works would be whatever we would train people in. But that's not how it is. We're trying to get to the truth of the matter. But we do also have an eye on that truth being exemplified in the world, lived out in the world. And so thereby we're always trying to see how what we're going to teach in the classroom contributes to the training of a person so that they serve the Lord well. And I think that really that marks out seminaries from other kinds of institutions and makes them analogous to law schools, which I thought was Dr. Mosley's point, which I thought was an excellent analogy. It's a training institution. It's very difficult and theoretical, just like law school is. You've got to learn about the intricacies of law and you've got to do logic classes at law school. But the result is trained for a particular purpose. And so I guess we see ourselves the same way. And that's an important thing to remember. So that's why the classroom to me is a place where you've got to connect those two worlds.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's like, yeah, that's really absolutely perfect because I feel like it takes two different kinds of people sometimes because I love that ambiguity. I love the nuance and you're learning about different positions and it's not clear cut. And the more you learn, the more I find it's really difficult to straw man. It's easy, but it's difficult to straw man somebody once you've like really studied their position because you're like, gosh darn it, they have a lot of good arguments. You're like, I can't just badmouth them, which would be the easy way to do it. But also, I feel like for me, when I talk to people, sometimes, my sentences die the death of a thousand qualifications. Like I'm like, well, I just want to be very clear. Like this is also a position that some people find viable and stuff because it's so like once you actually know it, and you're like, well, I don't want to speak dogmatically about this thing that I know is a sort of vague and like there's a lot of different opinions on it. And so I've ran into people who that's rubbed the wrong way, where you just can't. They're wanting very clear cut, sure answers. And when when you speak, you're always trying to tell them like, well, it's a little bit more nuanced, it's a little bit more complicated. There's room for grace. And yeah, I've run into problems with that. Has that been something you've dealt with in your kind of career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to sort of our approach to being reasonable and rational about things. You know, on the one hand, you have to accept that you're a fallible person and that you could be wrong about things. But that shouldn't, on the other hand, remove any convictions that you might have about the conclusions you have come to. And so those two things kept in tandem. One is, on the one side, you have to accept that being fallible, that you could be wrong. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that you then say, well, I really couldn't know anything. There was a famous quotation from, I think, Isaac Watts, maybe someone in a logic book by Richard Feldman. And in this quotation, he says that you can react to kind of rationality or arguments in a number of different ways. One way is you can just be swept off your feet by the latest thing. So you agree with the last person you listen to. Right, and the next person you listen to could disagree with them, but you'll change your mind with them. So you just go with whatever the person in front of you is saying, and you're like a reed blown in the wind. Right, there's no solidity, there's no nothing that keeps you rooted. Another approach could just be that you have one opinion and you absolutely refuse to revise it no matter what happens. So a great case could be presented against what you think, and you won't even budge not an inch. You just think your views are always going to be right. They're all necessary truths. They're as obvious to you as 2 + 2 = 4, and that's the end of it. And so you have these sort of dogmatists. And then you've got other positions, some more like a kind of a skeptical position, which says, I can never come to anything here. No one really knows. You're all just making arguments, but no one really knows. So there's nothing we can do here. So you can take that position to arguments too, which is just dismissive of all of them. They don't sway you, not because you're a dogmatist, but just because you don't think they're any good. Of course, you don't want to be like any of those people. You want to revise your opinions or your views in the light of really good evidence that overturns the evidence you already have. But at the same time, you don't want to be unable to state a position and back it up, knowing that at some point you could be proved wrong. Now, for theology, we often put this in terms of those doctrines that are so well supported by Scripture that it would take a great deal to overturn them. They're not set in stone to the extent that they are as certain as as possibly can be. Nonetheless, they are evidenced enough by Scripture that it would take a huge amount of evidence, of contrary evidence, which is yet to be produced, to overturn them. And so those are what we might call, in fact, I love what Danny Akin did a couple of years ago. He gave a sermon on 10 hills he'd die on. I think it was 10. I forget how many it was. It's funny. I think I've probably got pinned to the wall. I wrote it down. In fact, that long bit of paper you can see just behind me is also a Danny Akin sermon. I think it was the 75 theses of preaching or 99 theses of preaching or something like that. So I printed it up and I've stuck it on my door. I think I've probably got the 5 or 10 hills to die on. But what he was trying to do is explain, there are some things that are so well supported by Scripture and rational to believe that, you'd be prepared to die for them. Things like the value of human life, the penal substitutional atonement, inerrancy of Scripture, and those important doctrines are so important, and they're so well supported rationally that you can be confident in arguing for them. Now, does that mean you just claim them without listening to anybody else's point of view? No, right? That it doesn't follow from being really confident that you're right about something that you will never listen to somebody else's point of view and dismiss their arguments without considering them. That's not the way to go either. But yet there are lots of doctrines and theological points of view that are held with less grip, right? They are less well supported. They have a sufficient degree of evidence for belief, but not one that says hill to die on. So there are lots of theological views where we'd want to hold them a little lightly. But again, even if you hold them lightly, let's just say you're sort of 60%, if you drop below 50 and you should revise your beliefs, but you're at 60%, you're sort of over halfway with some of these doctrines. You can still support them with your arguments and still state them as beliefs. You genuinely believe they're true. But at the same time, you might be more open to hear cases from the other point of view. And it may be more likely that over the course of time, you will revise your views on those because the evidence isn't as good as it is for other opinions or other beliefs, I should say. And so I think just proportioning our confidence to our sort of measure of evidence that we have, or rationality we have, or reasoning we have for our beliefs, is just, intellectually a good thing to do. It's good for us. I think one of the things the Lord gives us the capacity to do is manage our beliefs well. And he's given us minds to do so. And varying depending on where he's placed us in the history of the world and the place in which we live in the world, with various resources which we can avail ourselves of in order to do that task. And I think that's doing due diligence about thinking rationally about our faith is a very important thing. And so that's partly why, working in a seminary is so glorious, because I get to help, pastors, future counselors think through their beliefs so that they're managed well. And that's part of this kind of intellectual foundation for ministry. It's not to say that you give them all the truths in seminary and they have to believe every single one of those things. And then if they believe all those things, then they will have a solid foundation. It's not memorization of sort of a set of doctrines. Instead, it's capacity to think well. And if you give you people that, then those doctrines are not just believed or committed to, but they're believed rationally. Like there is good reason to believe them, and they have those good reasons. Maybe an illustration here, if that's okay. Like I was thinking about this the other day. Sometimes you can be accused of not being rational about a belief when you've caused some harm. So I'll just give you two sort of scenarios. One scenario is, suppose there's a family that have never left their home, and the parents have an irrational belief that going outside will cause great harm to them, right? Something terrible will happen if they go outside, and it's irrational to believe that. They have either no reason to believe it, or the reasons they have to believe it are really bad, or false, or obviously false, or they are irrelevant to what goes on outside, whatever it might be. They formed an irrational belief. Now, in our present society, it would be quite likely that those children would be taken away from the parents. This would be considered a sort of somewhat of a neglect or abuse, and something that would be of causing harm to the children. Now, now consider a family who go to church in a society where the government who've just been elected thinks that it's abusive to take your children to church. And consider what these two sets of parents are going to have to say. When asked why you kept your children inside, the family who have not thought about it, they've formed an irrational belief, can be held kind of accountable because they've never thought about it. In the same way, for example, if someone went and kicked someone else in the shins on the street, you could go up to them and say, that's wrong. And they'd say, oh, really? Is it? I've never thought about it. You would be quite within your rights to say, well, you should have thought about it. So the parents who irrationally form the belief that if you go outside, something terrible will happen, and then kept their children locked up inside, have done some harm by not thinking rationally. Now, if the parents who take their children to church are asked the same question, you want those parents to be able to say, look, you might not agree with me. You might think that this is abusive, and you might even punish me, even though it would be unjust. But you can't make the charge of not having thought this through stick. Paul says this to Titus. You should morality should be such in the church as that they can't make the charges stick. These charges should be dismissed because they're not good. Now, you might still get harmed by people who don't like you, but they won't have made any charges stick. And in the same way, that charge of not having thought things through shouldn't be one that Christians should have stick to them, right? So when they say, I'm taking my children to church, they can't be accused of doing something abusive. And they need to have thought through what sort of rationally grounds that. And to do that, they will avoid the charge of never having thought about it, right? You ought to have thought of why you should take your children to church, or why you shouldn't kick someone in the shins, or why you should, or why you should keep your children inside when they want to go out. Those are it's a basic sort of feature of human morality or human responsibility that we ought to have at least thought about it. Now, we might not have come to the best conclusions using the best reasons, but the fact that we have used reason to come to conclusions is somewhat of an obligation on us to do so. And I think that's important to recognize, that Christian life is in part essentially a rational one. in part because you can't read the Bible without using rationality. At least you can't read it to understand what the author is saying and avoid using rationality. You can read it and just sort of see if it does something to you. But to figure out what is being said by the author, you've got to use rationality. And you can't live as a Christian without having thought about it either. And so I guess that's sort of a strong emphasis in my classes, is that just the capacity to think these things through improves your life, and makes you able to communicate what grounds your actions as much as it does gives you the capacity to communicate what grounds your beliefs, which of course is what we do in apologetics. But it's practical as well as theoretical in both cases.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. I think it's probably fitting to point out that you teach epistemology here, so
Yeah.
so this is an expert opinion. That's what we're saying here, folks. This is a well thought out opinion right here.
I have thought about it. It might not be quite to the standard of expert, but yeah, I was having, I shouldn't name drop, and I've only met him once, but JP Morland, I've got the incredible pleasure of having dinner with him the other night, and I do not know him, and he wouldn't know me from Adam, so I was just invited to a dinner with someone he does know. And he said that he wrote something very controversial as a chapter in a book that I was waiting to buy but couldn't get it because it was too expensive. I've now got it. It's a very good chapter. And he said, I got a lot of pushback. And he said that the one thing you want to avoid saying is that you haven't thought about it. You're just saying an opinion. And he just said to people who would give him criticism about what he wrote, and a part of it was political, is that at least I've thought this through. That's the important feature here. You may disagree with me, but you have to disagree with me having thought it through. You can't just lob stones. Yeah. You have to have a rational disagreement here, not just a kind of polemical kind of political battle. So I think it's sort of important obligation on us to do that, and I admire people like that who are prepared to be courageous. That's the bit I'd love to have more courage. Yeah. To say what I think is true, having thought about it. If I have a Substack, and on Substack, you've got the ones you have posted and the ones you haven't. And my ones I haven't are far outnumber the ones I have. And it's mostly due to courage. Am I sure I'm right here? No, I don't know. It's going to go, and it just descends into that pile of unpublished posts that never make it to the publishing point. And it's mostly that, like, I don't know. Am I sure? I'm not sure. And so people like JP Morland have a great deal of courage, I think. Yeah. And plenty of those philosophers do. And I admire that about them.
Yeah. I'm a fan of strong rhetoric and polemics, just because I think if they're well crafted, they're fun to read. Mm-hmm. But it is always nicer to see when they're founded on like good quality arguments, because then that feels like a real burn. It's like not only are you wrong, and I can say it in a profoundly beautiful way, but I thought about it long enough to do that. Like I thought about it a lot, and even after that, you're still that wrong. Like Tertullian's my favorite example of this. When he writes against Marcion, and you read that, like the intro paragraph, and he just spends like line after line talking about this place. And he's like, it's the worst place in the world. Everybody that lives there is a barbarian. It's horrible and cold and desolate. And then the very like last line is like, but the worst part of all is that Marcion's from there. And you're like, that's just like a slam. And then he just goes on to really like, Tertullian's so smart. He just goes on to smack him on everything. You're like, this is that, right? If I could write well and do a good job at arguments and things, that right there, that would be my higher calling. I would be a new Tertullian.
Well, I wish you well in that endeavor. Tertullian, famously sort of dismissing Athens. What does Athens do with Jerusalem? As if philosophers got nothing to add. Was actually very good at philosophy. So we want to give him credit as an excellent philosopher. I'm sure he'd be very annoyed at me saying that. But
probably.
Excellent philosopher using logic and using lots of Aristotelian arguments. And so things like that. So a good chap to be following in the footsteps of, I should say.
Oh yeah, for sure. I also, having mentioned political arguments and things from JP Moreland, and also some some imagery of a government preventing you from going to church. Oh, hold on just a sec. Sorry, I get a phone call. I'll edit this out. Hold on just a sec. All right, apologies for the brief intrusion. We'll edit that out. This is what editing's for. Everything's done in post nowadays. I'll probably just put up a whole green screen back here and do some
Yeah.
really awesome stuff later. This will be the Last Supper by the time I'm done. It'll be great. I'm also probably going to get interrupted again in 5 minutes, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there, when we hear the doorbell ring. But yeah, anyway, starting something we'll probably have to pause. You mentioned political arguments, and I know we've talked about political philosophy. What's your take on things in the political philosophy realm as it stands at the moment with your sort of native land? I'm always interested to hear what's going on in the UK, and I try to keep somewhat up to date. It seems like there might be a little bit of heat, a little bit of contention there with some different ideologies clashing at the moment. I just feel like you probably have some better insight into that, and even the cultural dynamics that are going on. So if you'd like to kind of speak to that, that'd be interesting to hear your take.
Well, I couldn't give you a great deal because I like everybody else am just getting a news feed, and I see some problems. I mean, just like every Western nation, the financial problems are pretty serious. I think that's true of the United States and most sort of nations that have large quantities of debt. Seems to be a tricky spot to be in. Yeah, I mean, I think they have their government is the Labour government, so they're more left-wing government. And so, they have a financial problem. I mean, there's all sorts of things I read about the UK that I would love to know whether, how much reason I would have to believe those things, but they're mostly from the news. So, you have to take a lot of that with a pinch of salt. So, for example, there are reports of a large growth of numbers of younger people going to church, which is a fantastic thing to hear about. But I don't know which churches and whether they are becoming Christians or just going. I don't know anything more than that. I do know that there are good pockets of evangelical Christianity in the UK. It's a very, very small percentage of the Christian population that are evangelical, those who would say they're Christian, that is. And so I'd be very excited to see some growth amongst evangelicals, and to see some growth in Bible knowledge and that sort of thing. And I write a regular column or post, I don't know a blog, maybe you'd call it, for Crosslands, which is an educational institution over there that we partner with at Southeastern, and they do MDivs for people over in the UK, and excellently run by a man called Dan Strange, just phenomenal leader. And so, I'm excited to see that. On the sort of other side of things, is there a decline in the social fabric? Maybe. I mean, they seem to be telling me there's lots of crime spikes and things, especially in London. Are the demographics changing? Maybe again. Still, it's not clear to me if they're changing everywhere or just in pockets. Yes, and I mean, if you want my take on political philosophy, it's sort of present state. There isn't really an advance in political philosophy. There's no Karl Marx to come along and change things at the moment. Is there a new political philosopher who's turned up on the scene like John Rawls or someone like that who's sort of radically overturning what we are working with? Probably not much. The battles are where they have been for some time post-Enlightenment, which has been, a consideration of, things like what kind of thing are we governing? So in political philosophy, you have to, before you figure out what the purpose of a state or a government is, you have to figure out what the kind of thing that you're going to govern. This is a very simple principle, but we often skip it. It's the same is true of counseling. If you say, I want to be a counselor, the first question you want to answer is, okay, what are you going to counsel? They might say, well, people. And you say, well, what is that? You ought to know the nature of the thing you're going to govern. And so I think, a lot of the political philosophy post, that sort of question being asked are just merely repeating responses to that question. So I'll give you a rundown if it'll interest your
Oh
hearers
yeah,
or watchers. You
absolutely.
know, the classic way to think about this used to be to consider us in a state of nature. And if you consider human beings in a state of nature, what would be true of them and the universe? Now, the state of nature is not the Garden of Eden, sort of prior to the fall. But what would we be like if we had no institutions, no political authorities like states or governments, no social institutions like classrooms and educational facilities, no arts, no cities? We're just thrown into nature just as we are with nothing else. What would be true of us? And so famously, people like Thomas Hobbes thought that with a bit of Newtonian physics combined with some introspection, he could come up with a good answer. He would say, well, we'd know two things would be true of us. One would be, we are driven by our desires. So I want to eat that cupcake over at the other side of the room. I'm going to go and get it. That's sort of what drives us. I want to eat that apple, or I want to go and swim in that lake. That's what we have wants, desires. It's introspectively, you can sort of see that desires, explain our actions. And he said the other thing that explains what we'd be like in a state of nature is Newtonian physics. And one of those is if something's moving, it won't stop moving until you stop it. So as my scientific lack of background putting that in rather layman's terms. But that would be true of everything in the universe, including human things. In Thomas Hobbes, you've got these two guiding forces. One is human desire, and that explains all the actions we do. So you want something, you go and get it. And the other is Newtonian physics, one of which the laws of Newton's laws is, things keep going until stopped. So once it's in motion, there's something is moving, it takes something else, some kind of force to stop it. So if you take those two things, if that's what human beings are, there's no morality in Hobbes's state of nature. So there's no oughts. There's just this mechanism that has desires and then moves in response to those desires, and it'll move until it's stopped. He said that the life in a state of nature would be terrible. Why? Because if there's one cupcake and 28 people going for that cupcake, then you're going to have a massive fight over who gets to eat it. So your life will be nasty, brutish, and short. It will be a horrible life, and it will be a constant state of war. And so he, of course, could develop a political philosophy from that. So you just have to ask yourself, well, what would the government have? What role does it play in life? Well, to prevent you fighting each other for that cupcake. So you need a very strong government that acts as the force that stops you going towards that cupcake when you're all on the way there with clubs and knives to try and get it. And that's what Thomas Hobbes thought the government should be. It was a very strong thing. And, like a king or a queen, someone who's extremely demanding and what they say goes. And that person's responsibility is to make sure that we don't descend into a state of nature. So you've got to do things to avoid it. Like you just got to force people to stop being what they would otherwise be in the state of nature. So that gives you a political philosophy. And all of the philosophers in the Enlightenment time did a similar sort of riff. They would start with the state of nature, and even Karl Marx somewhat starts with the state of nature. And instead of saying there's a state of nature and we need to consider what human beings are in a state of nature, he said, well, I think that human beings have a nature. So his great contribution was to just say there's no such thing as human nature. You're just you are what your environment makes you. So you think by nature you are sort of free marketeers and able to trade goods with one another equally, and you're religious and want families. You think that's your nature, but it's not at all. It's just mystery. That's just how things happen to be at the moment. But if you let me change your economic environment, you will be something completely different. There won't be like human nature, won't have anything to do with it. So you can even see Marx as postulating a kind of answer to the same question. But other philosophers did the same. So Rousseau said, no, in a state of nature, it would be totally different to Hobbes's state of nature. In Rousseau's state of nature, man has all his wants supplied. He's blissfully happy. And in fact, it's civilization that turns us into dolts. And it sort of degrades the human. The human without institutions, without civilization, without society is this magnificent thing. and all very happy and good, very good being in perfect situation. But due to one person, it takes one person to make us descend from this glorious state into a kind of civilization where we will become kind of doltish, is someone claiming private property. So he thought that this was, the undoing of our glorious start in life. And that generates a philosophy that can be applied to what government's for. So if you think that we became kind of uncivilized. At least we now are filled with envy and greed and wanting to one up on one another, and we want to get more money than somebody else. If you think that's what we're like because of civilization, but we are essentially good, then what's the government for? Well, the government is just to mitigate the bad effects of civilization. So one of the bad effects is that some people have more than others. So you should mitigate that by using the government to take that stuff from that one person and give it to the other person so everybody has the same, or at least no one has so much that they are completely unequal to the rest of society. So Rousseau's government is just generated by thinking that humans are essentially good, civilization made them worse, and we need to now mitigate its effects. See how that it comes? So when you talk politics, political philosophy is much easier because politics is really sort of emotional. If we're talking about the tariff policies, or we're talking about, Trump's view on this, on that, and the other. This isn't going to, it's not a good place to start because people's hackles are up. They either no or yes, or, there's all sorts of, it's very difficult to have a conversation. But actually what you should do is do a bit of political philosophy. You should say, what's the point of government in the first place? And then, you can then start to talk about these sorts of things. So I love political philosophy because it kind of explains what you believe about the government. And it kind of gives you some grounding for it. Of course, in America, you are indebted to an Englishman, I have to say, John Locke, who came up with another answer. I like John Locke quite a bit. I don't agree with everything he has to say, but I did name our rooster after John Locke. So we have a rooster called John Locke. We also have a cat called Karl Popper, but that's a story for another day. But John Locke wrote in his second treatise that, about the state of nature, and he just said that in the state of nature, you have rules, and that sounds strange, and because in the other versions I just gave, even Marx's, there isn't any morality that governs anything. In Hobbes's view, morality doesn't exist until there's a sovereign power. Why? Because laws are dependent upon power. That's the only thing that gets a law into being, is someone capable of enforcing it. If there's no enforcement, there is no actual law. It's just a piece of paper, or it's not even a piece of paper. It's imaginary. It's a myth. But when there's a power, now there's a law. And so Locke thought, no. In a state of nature, there are actually rules, because people have a certain set of natural rights that they possess, not because any government gives them to the people, but because they have them by nature. So Locke just suggests that these rights obtain when you exist: right to life, right to liberty, and right to the pursuit of property, which then got converted into pursuit of happiness. But you can hear the echo of John Locke in, of course, the Declaration. And he had one more that exists in the state of nature: the right to punish. So when someone else violates one of your rights, they steal something, or they kill somebody, or do something like that, then a person has the right to punish that person. Now, he said that eventually causes civilization to have to institute courts, because deliberating over who's innocent and who's guilty requires an authority to do so, and so you need a court. So you eventually can't help but establish civilization. But he says, in a state of nature, you have certain inalienable things that come with existence. You can't detach them from the existence of a person. Now, you might forfeit them, right? Not exercise them. It might be all sorts of things you can do with rights, but essentially the starting point is that you have rights that precede government. That's the phrase that Americans will use, and what they're referring to is this idea that they come by nature. So what's the purpose of government in that case? Well, of course, to preserve those rights that you already possess. So that's the idea, at least in its sort of germ idea, that's behind much of the American system, which is to describe those rights, to lay them out what constitutes this person here, these individuals, is that they have these rights. And what follows from those possessing those rights is that the government should act to preserve them, but more importantly, should allow them, those individuals, to preserve them themselves, i.e. to not get in their way when they want to start a business, to allow them, give them certain means by which they can preserve their own lives. So that's the sort of what sort of generates those sorts of political philosophies. At any rate, I've banged on about political philosophy, but it does fascinate me a great deal. And so I've rather recently got into reading about economics and reading all sorts of interesting works on that, because that also is a fascinating practical thing. It also is very important for us at the seminary. You may think economics is as far removed from seminary as possible, but it's not, because missionaries don't go on magic carpets. They go on airplanes. And as far as I'm aware, a missionary is a very expensive thing to get going, and we need money to do it. So I'm interested in economics and politics in part for ministry aims. We want to be able to use to live in a society where we can produce good amounts of money to afford to send missionaries to the farthest corners of the earth and support missionaries overseas. All of that comes down to how we spread the gospel. Is politics relevant to it? You bet it is, right? It always has been. When Paul was writing to the church, politics was super relevant. All that I said about, not having a charge stick when someone comes to you and says you're doing something bad to your children to go to church. Well, that was a clear and present danger in the time of Paul and Peter when they were writing to the early Christians. They were in trouble when they were going to church in some places. Now, how do you preserve the church? Well, you make sure that none of those charges stick. In fact, that seems to be, one of the Lord's means of preserving his people, is those charges don't stick. Why? Because the gospel set you free from sin. You're no longer bound by it. The gospel has given you a new orientation. You now love the righteousness that God is in Jesus Christ, and you want to live in obedience to him. And those things both adorn the gospel so that people will hear the gospel and see your life and then want to follow Jesus. But they also prevent you being besmirched by those in power. So all of these things are really relevant. So I think politics and economics and these sorts of domains, and particularly philosophical studies of those, are very relevant to our ministry, that we're tasked not only of doing, but seeing if we can preserve. Remember, in Paul, when he writes to Timothy, where he's writing to a church that's got all sorts of false teaching in there, and he tells him what to do. He's got to get good elders and good deacons, and when you get good leaders, you go in the right direction. I can tell you that's just true. In all my ministry, I've been under really good leaders in many cases, and you feel it. You're going in a good direction. So get elders. But what should you do with the congregation before you do anything else? And he says, pray. And you pray for two things. You pray for the authorities, i.e. those who are going to say whether you can do things or not. And you pray that they will be permissive of your activities, that they you will be allowed to keep doing these things, i.e. loving one another and proclaiming the gospel to the nations. And then pray for the salvation of all people, because the Lord wants to see a great reaping of a harvest in the mission field. So those two things, you've got to, top priorities. And I think, a lot of we don't want to ignore these subjects, because they're vital, in fact, for the practical work of ministry that the Lord has called us to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think often I see a lack of interest in, and this is just personally, but I think I see a lack of interest in political things or economic things, or from people in the church who just kind of just put their hands up like, that's not for me. That's not where I'm supposed to be at. So I think a healthy look at that is definitely helpful. And it's just a fact of life when Christianity is the dominant world religion, in terms of population, at least, you're going to have some interaction between Christianity and government. You're going to have some, like, somewhere along the line, your Christian values are going to inform some government somewhere. And so I think doing that in a well thought out way, and doing that in a Christian way is definitely going to be important. And I think there's a lot of potential for that in the United States. I know we're sort of all fractious at the moment, and we're kind of, uh, you know, pushing and pulling on each other, and we don't really know what to do. But I think, I I personally, as far as my political philosophy and knowledge goes, I do think that um, it would be it would be a great opportunity for Christians if some of the burden that is given to government, I think unnecessarily for like social welfare and things, if some of that could be picked up by charitable institutions or private donations from citizens, but from a Christian angle and a Christian lens. And I think as we go forward and governments everywhere seem to go bankrupt, you probably will have that. I mean, you probably will have, you know, Christian institutions doing a lot of the social welfare as they've done in the past. I mean, I think I read an account from, I'm a church history guy, so I was reading something from maybe Eusebius where he talks about there was a plague that came through Egypt at some point, and everybody knew who the Christians were because they were the only ones that didn't leave. They stayed and took care of everybody and helped, and it's that's the kind of stuff that I think Christianity's known for, and I think that can be a really positive aspect of our worldview and our message going forward as governments struggle to keep up with payments for things like social benefits and aging populations without new generations to support them. So
Yeah.
I hope that's what happens, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, it probably already does. I mean, the those who volunteer and do so quite often with the motivation of serving the Lord are very effective in what they do usually. And the big, great operations of government have their place, perhaps. But that kind of care for people is something that Christians can exemplify. I mean, just think about from my own sort of particular experience of working as foster parents and then adopting our youngest. Since then I've met lots and lots of Christians who just felt that being the hands and feet of Jesus to care for a child is so vital, and seen great growth in people. In fact, when you do it in a church, often people see it and think, I could do that too. And that's what happens, is there's a spread of just desire to care for people. And Christians, because they know the value of these human lives, we have this impulse of the Spirit to go and love people. And that's far more powerful than $1 bazillion thrown into an NGO. It just is. And I remember hearing a missionary to India once say something that was a very outlandish figure, but I've never forgotten it. He said that 97% of something like that, 97, I think it was 97% of relief and development work in India is done by 2% of the population. And he said they're the Christians. And now that might be an overstatement. I don't know. And I don't know where he got those figures from. It was a number of years I heard this. So maybe it was true then and it's not now. I don't know. But the point he was trying to make was that a very small quantity of people who are devoted to the Christian life can actually take on an enormous quantity of the work that's needed to help people in their plight. And that, now maybe he was just being anecdotal. I don't know that he cited anything. It was in an academic talk. So it was in a class on missions that I took at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford University. And he was a missionary in India and worked for, I forget, there was an Oxford Society, or there was an Oxford Missions organization, at any rate. And but that's a powerful thing to say, but it also, it does mark out the Christians. The Christians are those who want to get involved. Now, it's not to say no one else does. It's just that there's a great, once you know the gospel, it comes out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's part of what propels us to evangelism, in the same way it propels us to help hurting people. Evangelism is similarly motivated. I don't know who I'm going to tell the gospel to, and I don't actually have to know them before I meet them. but Jesus does. Jesus knows that person from before they even were born. And Jesus has heard that person's every prayer and every cry and every tear in the same way that a suffering person has. And when he sends one of us to go and either bring relief to that person or to proclaim the gospel to them, we are performing the task that he has designed us to do. He's called us in to do those good works that he prepared long in advance for us to do. And those works, are responding to his desire to reach that person. So you don't have to have ever met the person to know that somebody, namely Jesus, cares about them and is sending you to be his hands and feet or his mouthpiece to say the gospel to that person as an expression of his deep love for them. And I've never forgotten that with my youngest. He's only been in our home since he was 2, and he's 9 now. So there were years of his life that I never knew who he was. I never heard his name. And I sometimes remember that I wasn't there, but Jesus was watching him in the crib and knowing that he wanted to do something for him. And Holloway's at some point in our lives said, Jesus, here we are. If you have a child in mind, we'd love to have him in our home. And Jesus said, yes, I do have one, actually. This one I've been watching for these 2 years, and who I've heard every night, who is lonely, and I don't want to go into his past, but I saw all of that, and I want you to now love him and be the manifestation of my love to people. That's our call in the church is often to treat the sufferer by being the one who expresses the love of God. After all, lots of Christians believe that God exists, but when they suffer, they don't think that God loves them. They don't feel his affection. And how better to display the affection that God has for his people than for his people, the other ones, to display that love. And so I often think about that when it comes to evangelism and caring, like you say, having a social care, is that you think of yourself as expressing the love that Jesus has for people. And if you think of that way, you don't have to have a personal affection, although it may come as you do. As you talk to someone, you may think, I love this person. I so want this person to become a Christian. That may all occur too. But before you love this person, he loved this person, and you doing this for this person is an expression of that love to that person. So I don't know if that all makes sense, but
yeah,
it's
yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. And I actually think that's one of the great things about America is the government's potential in America to just get out of the way of genuine Christian altruism, to just kind of not have to be so heavy. It has the potential to do that. I don't know if it's done that well always, but it has the potential to not have to do so much oversight and to just let good people be good. And I think economically, it has the potential to give people the means. The American system has the potential to be such an economic powerhouse, which leads to genuine Christian altruism, having the means to go and be altruistic. And so I think it's one of the things I love about America, and it's one of the things I appreciate about it. The longer I go, I'm like, oh, this has, from like you said about Locke, it's the government enables those people by kind of diminishing its presence to protect their rights, to guarantee their rights, and to continue to preserve them themselves, instead of just always having to spoon feed them everything. It makes them want to be better, and I think that's definitely, it's so helpful and it's so unique.
Yeah, well, you're preaching to the choir. I'm a classic immigrant in that, my first breath of American air walking off the plane in Chicago in 2007 was the intoxicating feeling of liberty, which I just think immigrants have felt that first breath. You've always breathed the air, so maybe I love to hear the fact that you still appreciate it. But for the immigrant, it's that breath of fresh air is pretty intoxicating. I mean, it's slightly scary too. I remember that there were twin feelings of getting off the plane. One was utter liberty. I could pursue those things that I think are valuable, and here's a place I can do it. The second one is, and I better stand on my own 2 feet. I can't, there's not much to fall back on, right?
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Yeah.
It's not going to be given to you.
Yeah.
You have to work to get it. Now, those two feelings that go together in America, for me, as a sort of a very gut response to arriving in these shores, is
Yeah.
that it's up to you to do it, but there is the opportunity to do it. Now, that is rare around the world. But it's a beautiful thing. So I too affirm that love of
Yeah.
the liberty you have to pursue your own goods, and for us as Christians, those goods are the proclamation of the gospel to the world and the discipleship of His people, and those things take a lot of work, and they sometimes don't go as well as planned. But here you do have this freedom to do it
Yeah.
and to make it happen. Whereas many places in the world you don't have that freedom. It was greatly curtailed, or economically just there isn't the money to do it. There isn't the space in the market for these things. And of course, this for me is important because governments will never send missionaries, no matter how many Christians you get in Congress. They aren't going to vote for a bill to fund missionaries. So that's very important to remember because, there's all sorts of things we'd like the government to do, but remember they'll never put that on the list. So that is what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to fund our churches and you know, keep our church pastors employed and supported, and we are supposed to send missionaries to the end of the earth, and we'll do it to whatever capacity we can because we're obeying God. But we should note that those capacities are reduced by practical things like economies. So I totally resonate with what you're saying about, an economy that's flourishing is an economy that is allowing its citizens to spend their money where they please. And for Christians, that will be missions. So one of the prayers that's a good prayer for us Christians to have is, "Oh Lord, help us flourish economically." Why? Because the more we make, the more missions we can send. Now, of course, we could flourish economically and spend it on drivel and
Yeah.
not send any missionaries at all. Lord, keep us from the sin of
Yeah.
loving money more than what we can, and not being content, and therefore just spending it on stuff that we desire rather than spending it on missions and things that you desire. So, keep us from that. But at the same time, we want to flourish so that we can do these things. And watching, Southern Baptist Convention takes place over the summer, and I think it was just under 60 new missionaries sent to the field. That takes an enormous amount of cash that I'm so grateful to the Lord supplying through the American economy, and praying that it flourishes as well as every other country. We want more countries sending missionaries.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
I just went to Indonesia and met Christians over there who love the Lord and, would probably send lots of missionaries as well. So Lord, make Indonesian economy flourish. Lord, let economies where, there are Christians who are prepared to go. Lord, let those flourish, um, so that they might send.
Yeah.
And so it's not unique to us and we're just Americans, but it is important that those things are prayed for. Help us, Lord,
Yeah.
to do more here, to do what you've called us to do, and to help us flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's it's such a I don't think people realize how insulting an idea it is that you're essentially saying like the government knows how to spend my money better than I do. And it's like I get it. Like there are some things that if I kept all my money, I probably wouldn't contribute to. Like I probably there are some roads that probably do need actually paved. Lord knows that they actually get it, but that I probably wouldn't. I would just take a different path and be like, well, somebody else is probably going to pay for that road. But the idea that they take so much of your money and then spend it on stuff that really, I mean, at least now with the whole sort of like Doge thing and the USAID kind of controversy, it's insulting the stuff they spent your money on. Like it's personally insulting that you could finance things that stupid and then continue to tell us that you know better than we do how to spend our money. And so I think it does, and I think with that, kind of accepting the contrary there and saying, yeah, okay, you're right, I do know how to spend my money better. It, like you said, it is nerve wracking and it requires from all of us more thinking and a deeper kind of insight into what is actually good, because it is a lot of responsibility to have to govern yourself without somebody else holding your hand. That's a hard thing to do, but it makes you better. It makes you better to have to think about those things, and it makes you, and you do stupid stuff and you fail, and then you're like, okay, well, let me adjust. I'm guilty of that. I buy things that I don't need, and I'm like, well, now I'm out $100, and I need that $100 now. So like, I got to pivot. Like, how do I make this back? How do I?
Yeah.
But it having that trust and just being free to do that allows you to grow so much more than you could ever grow in a system that is so constrictive and so condescending in the way it kind of treats its citizens. And so I get why people like it to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And then in some ways I'm like, I just don't know how this manages.
Yeah, I mean, it's attractive to have other people take care of something that you have been taking care of, and they just say, "Let give it to me, I'll do all of it." Now that does sound attractive. Usually, though, when a need or a want is detached from the power to satisfy the want, or to get what you need, there's usually a great deal of chance of mismatch. So, for example, I'll take my own country as an example. Is it better that I pay for my health care, or that the government pays for it for me on my behalf? Now, of course, there's an attraction of not having to pay for it directly myself. Okay, I do pay for it by giving my money, well, having my money taken in taxes. I should be more, gifts are voluntary, etc. Anyway, my money's taken by taxes, and they pay. So the customer isn't me. I'm not the customer for my healthcare in the UK. The government's the customer. Now, businesses generally try to please the customer. So they're trying to please what the government's saying. And the government might be saying all sorts of good things, like we need this, this, and this. There's lots of people over here who need this. You need to up your work in this area. For example, there's lots of problems with eyes over here. Now, I'm paying you to deal with eyes. So yes, sir, I'm going to deal with eyes. Now, the eye people are being taken care of. But of course, it's very likely that another set of people, leg people or hip people, hip surgeries for older people, or something like that. Perhaps they haven't been taken care of. Now, ordinarily, if the money is with the need, the money draws the need to be met, because it's an exchange between someone who has the money. Now, it's not to say that these things are impossible to do, or they're completely immoral, or whatever it might be. And there may be all sorts of other arguments the other side. But your point, and I think is a good one, is that having someone else do it for you, in this case, amounts to somebody else purchasing the products that you would otherwise purchase. Sure. And it seems like there's a great deal of likelihood that quite often, although not always, and in some cases, the match may be perfect. The government wants something that you happen to want at that moment, and the money goes where you would have put it anyway, and you get the service you need. That happens quite often, but it's quite difficult to do. And I think, like you say, if you have to do it yourself, there's a responsibility there, but there's also more of a chance, or more of a likelihood, that you will get that need met, or you'll get that want satisfied if you're the one who's purchasing the product. The problem if the government is doing the purchasing for you is quite often they won't know what you need. Now, then the next election comes along, and there's a lot of leg people or hip people who are saying more hip, more hip, more hip. And the government then say, okay, we hear you, more hip, please. Now, that is the way that system works. Second thing I often wonder about, and this isn't something particularly worked out, but it's a good question, is it really cheaper? When we think about costs are generally, what the price tag on the product. But that's not what cost means. Cost means whatever it is you had to give up that you would otherwise have obtained in order to get this product. And that's another thing that I wonder about. For example, suppose you've got an option. You either repay your student loan yourself by paying a portion of your income over the period of 20 years, or the government pay the whole lot that day. You never have to worry again. Which one costs more? Now, I don't know, but I'm guessing that you could come up with a kind of figure that or a bunch of things that you could not do or have as a result of the government having done it, that you have actually given up in order for them to pay for it.
Yeah.
Now that's true of government systems, is that when they are the ones dealing with what you would otherwise have to deal with yourself, it sounds like the cost has been removed, but that's very seldom the case. Usually there is a cost incurred. It's just you can't measure it in the dollar number that you have to pay that day. But there's usually a result from having this amount of money used in taxes and that sort of thing that actually has a cost. You know, if the government pay for everything that you want in life, the cost likely is huge. And why is that? Well, because the cost will be the removal of opportunities that you would have otherwise had. The result of maybe a not growing economy or a shrinking economy, because there's less private money and less activity generating money, and governments don't make any money. So there's costs to be paid. They just aren't like price tag written. You know, they're not written in dollar amount that you're paying then. Now, there may be all sorts of good things to say on the other side, and I'm not suggesting I have slam dunk answers on this. But that is a question, isn't it? And it's certainly one that people ought to think about before they say, I want free such and such.
Yeah.
Now, you should say, is it really free though?
Free.
What if the service you got, having had the government pay for it, is worse than the service you would have got if you'd have paid for it? Isn't that also a cost?
Yeah.
That's what you would have had if you hadn't made them pay for it and you'd have paid for it yourself. That's surely a cost, even though you can't put it in dollar amount, right? So all of those questions fascinate me. Again, I've started reading economics a little more than I had before, so these are sort of probably novice questions. So you're certainly not speaking to an expert on these matters. They just seem like good questions.
It's all right, because I'm not an expert either.
And there's probably some good answers out there that one day I'll read, and you'll want me back on the podcast to say my expert opinion, rather than my rather uninformed set of questions.
Yeah, hey, I'm right here with you, and I think you're right. I think it's hard for us to sometimes conceive of cost outside of, especially when you're talking about something that is financial or like a purchase, outside of just the innate like cash that's involved, but really like, as somebody who is in fact broke, it is so good for your creativity. Like, you will think about ways to make money that you'll just be putting things that you'll be like, well, could I sell that club? Like, I can probably do that if I manage to, and you do lose that. You lose that ability to think, like, make a long-term plan or even a short-term plan that really works, because that is the goal. Like, if you're down to your last $50, you're not looking for something that's going to make you feel good. You're looking for something that's going to be practical and efficient and stretch that 50 as far as you can. And I think it's definitely important to think of. And I think another thing you kind of point out is, if the government buys everything for you, so if you have a market that has one customer, it is not improbable that your one customer can bully the person that's selling things, because they're the only competition, they're the only buyer in town. And so just as it's bad to have a monopoly on the side of the person selling, it's also terrible to have a monopoly on the side of the person who's buying, because that's no good for businesses. I would imagine a business is going to get strong-armed if the only person they can sell to says, well, actually, I don't want that, I want this. It's like, well, we don't do that. Well, too bad. I guess you're not going to exist anymore. It's like, that's a terrible. It might satisfy, that business might satisfy the needs of, half of who the government is supposedly trying to represent, but because of some poll or a last election cycle or election cycle coming up, the purchasing becomes totally pragmatic about themselves, and they just go for whatever they think is going to get votes, and they strong arm a business that could have actually kept some people who really needed help,
yes,
with good care. And so I think, yeah, I have so many, like, I'm so curious about people, especially on the left, who are so afraid of businesses and corporations and and just companies in general, and like how evil they can be and how manipulative. And I get that there's a real fear there that like these companies can be immoral and can act terribly and take advantage of people. But the idea that you could invest one monolithic government that has no other competition, you can invest it with all authority in the land and not end up with something as bad as one monolithic company, except it would probably be less efficient. You know, the idea that there's no risk on that end is baffling to me. I just don't understand how people get to that conclusion.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that Christians can do here is help people think about our problem with sin, isn't just, that some people are bad, but that all of us have the propensity to do wicked things. The Bible is replete with examples of people who fall, who started great. Like, think about David. He's the ideal king, yet he behaves abhorrently in his reign, particularly the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah. So that's true of everyone, though. Like, businesses can be evil. Why? Because we can be greedy and mean and selfish and awful as human beings. And there's, give person power of any kind, business or political power. And you have to figure out how to live with that. And one of the things I appreciate about the American system is this sort of checks and balances, that no one gets all the power. Lots of political philosophy is based on the idea that if you give someone supreme power, things will go well because they will order absolutely everything according to the way they want it. And that will be orderly. Even if you don't like it, it will be orderly. So, just been reading some of the early myths, Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish and the Hesiod's work. And a lot of that's based on the idea that, supremacy is actually a solution to conflict. There's lots of conflicts between the gods and in Enuma Elish, for example, but really things go well once you've got Marduk, who becomes this supreme power, and he's the supreme leader, and Babylon is his city, and everything is ordered, and that's really the cure for conflict. But it's just a an idea that is false, that we won't fight each other if you sort of give someone supremacy. Because we're awfully apt to feel that perhaps once we've got everything made in our image and ordered out how we want it, there'll just be no more trouble. It's just never true, because human beings are rebellious and we flout God's laws. And putting a human up there who is that kind of thing, right? A kind of thing that is going to rebel and is going to have sin difficulties and disobey God is not the right thing to make a supreme ruler. Of course, the Bible teaches that God is no such being. God himself, being perfect, is a rightful king, and under his rule, there will be justice. So we hope for a kingdom that is where God reigns over all of us, and because he's perfect and has the right to rule over us and can order things correctly, we would live in a conflict-free, peaceful world. Now, of course, the people he reigns over must be different too. And that is to say, we must be reborn, and ultimately in the kingdom we must be glorified, given bodies that comply with our love for Christ and our desire to obey him. So we hope for such a kingdom to come, whereby we are rid of all this sin. But in the meantime, we shouldn't naively think that when you put people in power, they're going, even the best people, They're going to do all the right things because, we've trusted them. In every case, we're going to have fallible human beings who are going to make a lot of errors, and even the best of our leaders are going to make mistakes, even if they're unintentional mistakes, and they're going to harm people when they don't intend to harm people. And that's just it's just a warning to us all to avoid thinking that there are people who can manage us brilliantly because they're so competent. Competency is not all that's required in governments. You require virtues, and you require an incredible amount of restraint to allow people to go their own way so that you don't hurt them. Because governments are the most powerful things we have on earth, and they're awfully inclined to hurt the people they govern, but certainly the people they don't govern as well. And, trying to restrain the amount of hurt that's done is a very tricky thing. And of course, the American system is partly set up to try and do that, having the separation of powers so that one group of people can't get the upper hand over the others. One branch can't be superior to the others. And at every stage, there are ways to block what's going to happen. And that's just to reduce the inevitable negative effects of all policies, really. Just about everyone is going to have a negative effect on somebody, and to restrain that power so that it does the least harm possible whilst producing those goods that governments can produce to secure the inhabitants of their countries and that sort of thing. Those things can be enjoyed, but we have to be very wary of all the things that us humans can get up to, whether we lead businesses, whether we are philosophy professors. The Bible warns philosophy professors as well as every other kind of teacher that their tongue can be a fire. So going on a podcast like this for me, I'm watching this thing saying, Lord, keep this thing from causing harm out there. Even if being as it's an early start to your podcast, not many people will watch. It doesn't matter. Small flames can start big fires. So you have to ask yourself. You say, God, I'm a sinful person. Please restrain any evil effects from what I say. And that's true in the classroom as much as it is on a screen. And that's true of everyone. Whatever position in life you are, you have the capacity to do some good, to honor the Lord, and to be moral, and to help and benefit other people. But you also have potential to do a lot of harm, and that would be true whatever position you're in life. So it is a rather naive approach to just the way the world works, to think that government can kind of secure the best, and those people will be immune from those things, whereas business leaders never can be. They'll always be awful, and the government has the potential to be great. You think, I don't know, because they're still human. So they're going to have this problem wherever they go, and the best thing you can do is restrain their wicked effects. Much of the Bible is like that, by the way. Much of the Bible, the Lord there is evil that occurs, and the Lord will supply rules to restrict the extent of that evil. Look at the divorce laws in the Old Testament. You don't get divorced, but recognizing that you're doing it anyway, I'm going to make a rule that means you can't just put that woman from house to house. She can't just be dumped on every house and then has to go to another house. She can't get married 500 times in a row. You can't do that to women. So there's a restriction to how evil you can be. And that's true throughout the New Testament as well. There's how do you make a bad situation not as bad as it could otherwise be? And that's often how the Lord works, restraining the evil's extent. The great men of old that were having lots of children, and wickedness was spreading all over the earth rapidly. And these guys were living to 1,000 years old, and they were just dominating the scene. Now, the Lord didn't take away all the evil. He just made it less bad by making the lifespan of people less, so that it couldn't occur to the extent that it was. Yeah. So much of the way we live is to recognize that there are evils we'll always have with us, like poverty, and that we try and restrain the extent of those evils to some degree. And the American system recognized that to some degree. It was to say we can prevent the worst effects of human beings having an enormous amount of power. How? By never letting them have all of it in one place. So you divide it, And that annoys people because you want things done right now. We need to do this. And it takes a long time. And it's, oh, we need to be able to do things quick. No, you don't understand. We're not good. We're going to do things wrong. So check at every
Yeah.
point and then make sure, those powers never get unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good feature. That it might be frustrating, but it's just
Yeah.
just think about yourself. How sinful we are. That we're just so prone to take what we have and use it for wicked ends. And it surprises us when we do it. We think, how could I do that? But we do all the time. I imagine those are the worst things that people have done. They say, that wasn't me. I didn't do that. Really, that was me? That's so unlike me, they say. No, that is actually kind of like you. We're like that, and we aren't. So don't put us up there too much.
Yeah.
Try to restrain the effects of those instincts we have for wickedness.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great. Yeah. I feel like approximation is a often neglected Christian virtue. I think just trying to like it's a bad situation. It's not going to be like we're not going to jump from bad to perfect, but
Yeah.
we can jump from bad to slightly less bad to a little like a little less bad, a little less, and then. But I really do feel like there is just this kind of either or sometimes with Christians, especially in like the political realm. It seems like to me there's this kind of just it's either got to be exactly what it should be or it's not at all. And it's like, well, just approximate it. Just kind of like take what you got. It's we're never going to have the perfect thing here. And I
Hmm.
think the founding fathers were like that. I think they were realist. I think they understood that like things weren't always, stuff was going to get broken. And they weren't trying to establish heaven on earth. They were just like, what's the best that a rational, sort of theologically sound group of people can, or at least minimally theologically sound group of people can do with the situation at hand, given all of the factors. Because it wasn't orderly, it wasn't like neat. They had fractious little parts and things, and people weren't always seeing eye to eye. But they got in a tiny little box, in Pennsylvania or wherever, and they just fought it out. And they were like, "Hey, let's argue, and let's not leave until it's somewhat better than we started." And yeah, I think we forget that sometimes in our pursuit to have like perfection. We forget about being a little bit better.
Yes, I think, my youthful idealism has been shed to some degree for that reason, is that there are ideals. Plato's Republic is a good example of this. In his Republic, there are two questions. One is this possible? And this republic, the idea of the city state, being organized. Now, I don't think I'd want to live in one,
Yeah.
but thank you very much. But certainly, I don't think philosophers would make good kings. But I'll leave that discussion for another time. But the point being is, you've got to think about whether this is possible. Is the ideal, conceivable? Does it contain anything irrational in it? But the second question is really important. The second question is, can we do it? I.e., can we get there? And of course, to this, Plato says no, because no one is going to pick a philosopher king, so it's not going to happen. But in one side, I mean, he does
Yeah.
actually say only if. Right? He gives it as a condition, but by implication, I kind of think he's slightly pessimistic about it. But the point being, that those two things go in tandem, don't they, with any decision. In fact, it's not merely political, but any decision. But think about a political one. Think about. I think actually Bill Gates said this. Malaria. We must get rid of malaria by any means possible. I think that was his line. I saw it quoted it on a newspaper. Now, do you mean by any means? Right. Can we imagine a world without malaria? Yes. is a world without malaria even possible? Maybe, but you first have to figure out what you'd have to do to get there. Now, do you mean by any means? Because I could rid of the world of malaria quite easily. If malaria is a disease that human beings have, if we remove human beings, there would be no malaria. How about that? Would that be a means acceptable to you? You just said any means. So, and now I'm sure he didn't mean that, because if I said that to him, he said, no, I didn't mean that. What he was saying is, we should really try hard to get rid of malaria, and I've got some ideas and some money. That's probably all he meant by it. But that rhetoric, you have to be careful. Like, human beings can achieve all sorts of amazing things. And idealists are awfully prone to saying we must achieve our ideal by any means. And often in history, as we've learned, is that once you've set yourself an ideal to get to, you now have to find out how to get there. And it turns out that getting there requires you to do all sorts of things that you would either rather not do, or actually it turns out you quite enjoy doing them. And so you do them to the maximal extent. And history is littered with stories of leaders, unfortunately, those who have led large amounts of people, usually rulers of governments who have risen to a kind of power status that human beings shouldn't have actually just run roughshod over people to get what they want and to achieve their ideal. Now, they usually don't get to their ideals, but they usually have caused an incredible amount of harm on the way of getting there. And I think that question is just worth asking for all of us. That all of us have ideals of how things ought to be. A pastor arrives in a church, he's just been newly appointed as the pastor, and he's imagined his ideal church. The imagination should be brought into touch. If you've got a good imagination and you've imagined where your church is going to be before you arrive at the church, and then you arrive at the church, just say to your imagination, you just be quiet for at least 10 years. I don't want to listen to you at all. I don't want to imagine my Sunday service. I don't want to imagine my counseling sessions, nothing. Don't use your imagination. Just turn it off. Read fiction, imagine the worlds of Tolkien or whatever you want to do, but don't imagine your church at all, because it can lead to having an ideal in mind and then then being annoyed that it doesn't get realized, and then doing things that you otherwise wouldn't do in order to achieve it. But that it's to realize that you've got to ask yourself what must be done in order to achieve this ideal. And oftentimes the answer is all sorts of bad things or not doing all sorts of good things. So let's instead say, what have I got to work with? And what can I do with what I have? What has the Lord given me? Yeah. One of the things Paul talks about in his letters, pastoral epistles particularly, but I think I was just reading it in 1 Timothy, is contentment. Everyone desires food and clothing. It's not wrong to do that. In fact, everyone, like you've just expressed, desires to make some money so that you can live and pay the bills and that sort of thing. This isn't wrong. But when it's not accompanied by contentment, it leads to all kinds of evil, says Paul. The love of lucre, when not accompanied by a sense of satisfaction or contentment with what the Lord provides, it's going to, or if you're never satisfied, i.e., you're going to commit all sorts of evils. And that's true of all human beings. And so, when you turn up to want to do something and you're in charge, you're going to want all sorts of things, and you're not going to be satisfied until you get them, and then you'll want more. And that's going to lead you to do all sorts of things that you would otherwise not want to do, things that might be harmful or evil, actually. And so you want to, I think you're absolutely right. You have to work with what you've got. So a pastor has to work with what they've got. If they've got musicians that aren't as good as the last church you were in, and they have to lead worship, those are what you've got, and you can honor the Lord with those people. If you've got parishioners who aren't so excited about evangelism and you want them out on the street, those are the people you've got to work with. They can't meet your ideal, not overnight at least, and so you have to work with whatever you've been given, and that's a good principle in ministry, I think. It avoids the frustration of always just being at odds with the way the world is and having an idea of how it ought to be, and how annoyed you are that the way the world is doesn't fit your ideal. And at that point, again, I just say, switch that imagination off, or go and read a good work of fiction and put it to some other use. Your imagination isn't serving you there. Use your observation at that point. Go and have a look. see what you've got, and then think what could be achieved. Don't imagine it, because you'll make another ideal. Just ask yourself plain questions about what can be done here. What could this person do?
Yeah.
What can this family contribute to the church? How can this person be encouraged enough to get involved here?
Yeah.
You know, who could lead that program, even if there's no ideal leader? Who's here who's willing and capable of doing it? Those sorts of questions are much better, I find, in ministry. And then actually things get done.
Yeah.
And what surprises you at the end of it is you see once in a while you see a snapshot. You'll see a moment where you think, hey, this is fantastic. And you think, how? But I never imagined any such thing. And great leaders often say that. They will often say, I had no idea that it was going to turn out like this. And you think that's because you did not expect it to be like your imagination.
Yeah.
Right? You just said, okay, here's what we've got. Let's see what the Lord does. And you just go for it with what you've got. And then it just surprises you as to how it works out. You think, wow, I never thought it would be like this. I had no idea. No, I never could have imagined this in my wildest dreams, they'll say. And that's actually a sign of someone who has probably worked to that point without trying to force people to get to some ideal that they've sort of pre-planned in their mind. It's not to say you can't plan. It's just to say you should take into account the fact that things aren't going to be as you have them in your ideals. And political philosophy is replete with immensely attractive utopias. And none of them have ever existed, these utopias.
Yeah.
And getting to any utopia has usually, once someone has set their mind on it, has usually caused immense amounts of trouble. There's all sorts of things you've had to do to people that are not good. And we should just try and avoid that sort of practice as leaders, I think.
That's definitely solid advice. I think it's so weird to me that as a culture we we pat ourselves on the back and like give ourselves such a break sometimes with like all of the self-help and stuff and just the the empathy talk of like, well, you're not perfect, you're never going to like just be kind to yourself and stuff. But then on like a cultural level and on like a job level and on like all of these levels, we impose on other things besides ourselves this ideal, and we try to like we just drive at it. And you're like, it would be nice if we took some of the kindness that we show to ourselves, or we're told to show to ourselves at least, and put it on things like other people and other institutions that maybe aren't going my way and the job. So I think yeah, it's we have weird ways of loving. And being kind of open to what happens and recognizing that life isn't neat and tidy when it involves us.
Yeah.
But then when it involves everything else in our lives, we're like, it should have been better. You're like,
yeah, you've got to balance all of that with a drive to work hard, I think, haven't you?
Yeah.
It's it shouldn't entail thinking, oh well, it doesn't matter how things turn out.
Yeah.
No, that's not the point at all. The amazing results of hard work is something always surprising, isn't it? Like you work hard and things occur, generally speaking, and it's a good lesson to learn, isn't it? That you just put your mind to it and you work hard and you try and do the best you can, and it is amazing what happens as a result. And a thing that I found sad in England was that we had a large underclass, and I'm sure it's true here too. And underclass that does not get educated, never gets employed, and has incredible dysfunctional families. And I worked a lot with these kids, and it was rather heartbreaking, but very heartbreaking because it's difficult for them to escape. Like they're trapped in it. It's generational, and they never really get to work hard on anything. And that actually just robs them of so much in their life. They never really had to do anything. And as kids, that made them think that this was great fun. They could do whatever they want and have just a big party. But when you saw their parents or other people in the community who were older, you could see that it just sapped their desire to live, that they felt meaningless about life because they never had to do anything.
Yeah.
And that's a desperate situation to be in, especially when you realize you want to do something and now it's too late to get started, or you find it's just impossible. It's just, what could you possibly do? You're at the moment you're being given money for doing nothing, and you could do something, but you would get far less. And the choice is so difficult. So in England, that's definitely it's definitely a bad side effect of things like welfare. Now, I'm not
Yeah.
saying we shouldn't do welfare. I'm just saying that um, when someone hasn't had a chance to do something, they do feel this sense of having wasted
Mhm.
their life, and that's very, very sad. Um, and it can give people great sort of make them disgruntled and disillusioned and somewhat cynical about life in general, and that's a sad result.
Yeah.
So, whilst you don't want to be idealistic, um, the opposite is no good either, where you say, well, if I'm not idealistic, then I have to take the polar opposite position, which is
Yeah.
I don't do anything or try anything, and I don't plan to try and achieve anything, because that would be to be idealistic. No, it isn't, but you might end up with just as frustrated as you would be if you try to achieve an ideal and it can never succeed without doing all sorts of evil. Not doing anything is also to end up in a state where you're frustrated that you didn't do anything at all. And so doing something and working with what you've got and making whatever you've got as good as it can be, and then seeing what the Lord does. That's a sign of contentment, isn't it? That you have worked hard and you've done the best thing you can, and you say, Lord, there it is. I've worked hard, and there's my fruit, and here am I, and I'm going to be satisfied with what you've done with it. That's immensely satisfying.
Yeah.
To be content um, is an enormously good spot to be in. Paul has, despite the fact he should have really bad psychology, he should be filled with angst and sort of regret from his past when he did intentionally hurt people. After all, he wanted to murder Christians, persecute them. He wanted to wipe them out. Here's a person who should sort of have great sort of grief over himself and anxiety, but he has enormously good psychology. I think a therapist would have very little to do with Paul. He would say, "Okay, I think you're fine. Carry on." Paul describes contentment of his own self, that he's content in what he does, works extremely hard, and sometimes he gets beaten up and thrown out of a city. Other times he has to flee quickly. He can only spend a few weeks there. He's not always like it's not like he's going around in limousines. Yeah, he's enormously content. He's a happy chap with where he is in life because he's content with what the Lord does with him. And I think to me that's sort of a great. If I'm to have an ideal, it's that.
Yeah.
I would love to just end up content. The Lord has used me, and I've worked hard, and I've attempted to serve Him and allowed Him to govern my actions and confessed to Him when I haven't, and received His forgiveness and moved on, got up and had another go, and just be content with what God provides as a result. We all want food and clothing, but it's contentment that makes that food and clothing good. If not content, that food and clothing is not enough, and that is the root of evil, right? It's the desire, never being satisfied. You just want to eat one more cupcake. Cupcake number one was not enough. 2, 3, 4, 28. You're still going because you're not satisfied. That's what gets us, is never being satisfied with it. And I think that's a state to avoid. Just gratitude for what the Lord has given us and working with what we've got, rather than expecting something more that we don't have and being unsatisfied with what we have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was an amazing statement. Amazing kind of wrapping it up. I've kept you 2 hours basically. I feel like at this point I can't ask for any more of your time. But it's been absolutely phenomenal talking to you, and this is just a real good way to kick off. I guess whatever this is. I guess this podcast. I promise you, if this goes anywhere, you will have many more appearances if you like. This will you the podcast is my podcast, Sue podcast, or whatever it is, me podcast, Sue podcast. You can come on as much as you want.
Thank you.
But yeah, that was a great conversation as always. Like I said, a gentleman and a scholar, and there are so few of you left. But yeah, it's been wonderful talking to you. Do you have any final thoughts? Any closing words? Parting wisdom?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it is an honor, and I've enjoyed very much being on your podcast, and I'd be very happy to come on again if your audience can bear listening to me waffle on. And I will reach a limit for what I have to say. There's only a certain finite amount of stuff to say, so I can't come on all the podcasts, but very happy to come on another one. And glad to do it. I think it's important for us to have a presence out there that people might listen in on our conversations. This is the kind of thing that we're interested in here at seminary and just in Christian life in general. These are the kinds of things we talk about. And if you have interest in knowing what we think and knowing how we discuss matters, then these sorts of things are very important to have out there on various platforms so that people can kind of eavesdrop on a conversation like this. I think the form is a good idea. The interview style podcast, usually you've got sort of half a mind to the audience, but quite most of your mind is on the other person. So you are to some degree listening to somebody's conversation. And this is one of the more insightful ways to learn about what people think, is to listen to how they talk to one another. So I hope it's of benefit to those who listen.
I'm sure it will be. And hey, if I ever get an actual studio or something, then we can do it in person, and that will be awesome. That'll be really great. That'll be a treat. So, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come join me. So I'll leave you to the rest of your day. I don't really know how to close out a podcast. I've never done this before. So I suppose this will just be it, and maybe I'll put some great transition at the end, and it'll be like the PowerPoint slide with the origami. It just flies off into the.
That's right.
Into the next slide.
You'll probably edit this little last section where we've ended the podcast. You'll probably do that. You'll probably edit it out. But there are a couple of things that podcasters do. They have one line they use at the beginning, and they have one line they use at the end, and they use the same one every time. So that's a good way to do it.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, my name's Carter Truman. This is the Carter Truman Show. See you next time. It'll just fade. It'll just fade into. It'll blur, and everything will just go off. Yeah.